welcome Rory Hyde.
Thanks very much to ArtSoc for inviting me, and especially thanks to Julian and Earl for coordinating it, and the students, and particularly Paul for his reaching out in the first place, and to Alan, John, of course. Now I'm going to talk about future practice. It's a kind of lecture of other people's work, which I feel funnel into this theme of where architecture is going. Is this sound okay, or does it sound weird?
Sounds
It's
good.
good?
Yeah, it's very good.
Okay. I'm getting a strange echo. No, it's fine for me. Yeah, it's a kind of narrative through the changing position of the architect up to where we are today, perhaps, and then a kind of speculation into possible directions that we could pursue in order to revive or regenerate the position of the architect. The kind of big story for me is, how do we get back in the big game of economy, of strategy, of large-scale thinking, and sort of become the people who have the answers like we used to be. So I'll kick in. This is my kind of crisis collage. It's an evolving collection of things going wrong in the world. I would suggest that that's become the kind of defining context, a sort of new state of normal rather than an exception. They're all real. The banana crisis was one that hit Australia, where I'm from, and curiously, people, when the price of bananas skyrocketed, people bought more bananas because it was this kind of, we need to have bananas, So that's something perhaps that architecture can solve. And that's the point. All of these crises have a spatial consequence, and it's something I think we need to engage with in a more direct way. But meanwhile, architecture is having a kind of crisis of relevance. We complain of marginalisation from the process of real decision-making, of being treated like cake decorators, only interested in styling, undervalued financially, over-regulated, too exposed to the instability of the market, as the latest economic crisis has proven, and many more. This is a real crisis. This is a kind of snapshot I did a few weeks ago. Cover of the London Evening Standard with this guy who can only get menial jobs with his architecture degree. The New York Times tells us to go to college but not to major in architecture. Pretty direct advice. This is the number of architects claiming unemployment benefits over the last 10 years. And yeah, CNN, etc. This is the kind of view from the ground compared to the view from the news. This is a t-shirt that Arcus made during the last crisis, so in the early 90s. And it feels like it sums up a lot of sentiment that I see around architecture schools. And it's not just the students. This is David Chipperfield. He feels more and more impotent in doing real things and having an effect, which is curious for someone who's created a career out of making architectural effects. So this is another interesting portrait of the contemporary profession. Olga Sheeran, former partner of OMA, co-architect on the CCTV building in Beijing. He was invited to co-edit the issue of Wallpaper last month. And this is a self-portrait that he commissioned from a Chinese artist. This is our hero in the centre, surrounded by his chaos of his office. Everyone seems to be wearing either pyjamas or prison uniforms. The cities they're designing are sort of heaped among the rubbish of the office. Some of them are on medical drips. You can see this is one here. There's another one standing there. And yeah, the pyjamas maybe refers to the fact that they've been there all night, and the prison reference perhaps but they're not allowed to leave, or they can't, or they don't feel obliged to. So this is a sort of, and this is from one of our stars, a kind of reflection of where we're at, perhaps. We used to be at the centre of the action. So this is a Berlage's Plan Zout for Amsterdam, which is where I've been living, and been lucky enough to live in some of these buildings, which he's sketched out. I kind of, without wanting to be too nostalgic, this was a time when an architect could do a city and balance the political forces with the economic forces, with the social forces, and into something which is what I would describe as a generous inheritance on a city. These areas are really desirable still. They have schools, they have parks, they have open space, they have quality architecture that's meaningful, and it's something that I'm not saying that we need to recreate it in this way, but a society who can build two statues like this, these form part of the Plan Zout. On the left, a woman passing down her knowledge to a girl on peace, I believe. There's a peace dove there and flowers. The kind of social cliches are relevant to the day. And the man is teaching the boy about industry and engineering. So it's kind of quaint, but also it speaks of a society that could, with a straight face, claim to think into the future about the next generation. And meanwhile, when we were called upon to give the answers, this is what we delivered: QUB's sweeping hand of the Bill Ready Youth. And this is how it manifests in the post-war, when society came looking for the answers, or looking to us for the answers. The Bilmer, which is adjacent to Berlage's Plan Zout, is this Corbusian-style high-rise towers within the green field. Except, as is so common with so many of these developments all over the world, it's been plagued by social conflict, poverty, crime, everything. It's Holland's pruit ego, and I'm sure Ireland has an equivalent. So our ambitions were popped. The moment when architects had the greatest power and were looked to to have the solutions for society, our decisions were so misguided and have led to such issues that I feel that we've lost the ambition to make grand schemes again. Could we ever be trusted, and why would we be after this? This is a plane crashed into the Bilmer in 1970, and although it's not a result of this decay, it came to be a symbol of this socially problematic area, and just was another reason for people to move out and to leave it to the incoming refugees. So Wouter van Stiphout, who's my kind of go-to man on Dutch history and designers' politics, asks, can we blame the architect? Can we just, is architecture, can we blame it for at least part of the poverty, alienation, frustration, aggression and crime that occurs in these post-war housing estates? And perhaps it's not important who we blame, but there will be no trial. But it's important, I think, philosophically for us to confront it. If architecture can, on the one hand, claim to solve problems, then it's only logical that it also can be blamed. And if it can be blamed, then if it can't be blamed, then it also can't be thanked. So I think if we claim to make social transformation, we also need to be prepared to take responsibility. Now, following this is a kind of history light. It's a manipulated history. I'm saying there's been three forms of retreat from social relevance. The first is the retreat into the avant-garde, the kind of safety of the abstract, the safety of the speculative, where it doesn't need to hit the ground in a meaningful way. The second retreat has been commerce, so to surrender our ambition, to surrender our own vision, and to blindly deliver what the developer asks. This is Dubai, a sort of direct manifestation of the architect in complete complicity with the demands of the market. This is another view from the ground, another shot of shoulders. This is Clive. I don't know if you can read it. He's got his phone number there. He has experience, 27 months experience on mega projects. That's his one-line CV, looking for, and he's walking around the Dubai cityscape, which is the kind of trade fair for mega projects. He's looking down for Clive. And then the third retreat, I would say, is into icons. So this idea, you know, we, on the one hand, deliver commerce, and on the other hand, we deliver pure image. And this is probably the apotheosis of that logic, a project that I'm not proud to have worked on. MVRDV's Cloud, which created so much unnecessary controversy for its association with the Twin Towers. And then, meanwhile, the popular response has been to get busy, to kind of, you know, dig the soil in our gardens. And I would say, you know, this is terrific. There's a huge amount of resourcefulness. There's a huge amount of enthusiasm. The public are interested. But meanwhile, at the point when we're facing our greatest challenge, I would say our response has been its most polite. So this is the kind of condition. This is the shrinking iceberg map of the architectural office here in the centre. And meanwhile, more enterprising disciplines are encroaching on our sovereign territory. And I think, rather than seeing this pessimistically, we should see this optimistically. So we should be looking at where there is growth, where there's interesting ways of approaching the physical environment, and borrowing techniques, borrowing tactics, and incorporating them into our own practices. So that's kind of where the book comes in. And what the approach that I've taken is to try and articulate some new roles which the architect might occupy. They are not sort of exclusive jobs, they're not new disciplines, they're not new career paths, but they might be a role that you adopt for one particular project, or a role that you, you know, can look at and learn from or collaborate with. So it's a sort of pluralist perspective on paths forward. And each of those are told through interviews with people who I think are really on the ground, really executing that kind of work in the real world today. So this word future in the title is used in the William Gibson sense of the word, in that it's a future that exists but is not evenly distributed. And so, yeah, the mainstream is kind of, it's going to take time for the mainstream to catch up, but I think we need to set some points out in space where we can shuffle towards. Now, Dan Hill, who contributed the preface to the book, sees this edge of architecture, which is in the title, as an edge between, you know, architecture as it's traditionally defined and the stuff that's beyond, and divides the contributors along those lines. So we have non-architecture out here, we have an artist, we have a former graphic designer slash thinker. Marcus comes from a events background and is now interested in policy. Matt Webb makes digital products. Camilla is a graphic designer who's doing urban activism. And I could go on. These guys are more traditional, or at least they have practices which they describe as architecture, and then there's some people who can really go either way. Now, I'm going to talk about 5 practices or projects that I can pull out of the book, and they kind of align with these big themes which I mentioned at the start. So, first up, in terms of, and I would say that these are the areas where we need to perhaps not fully embody, but at least know enough about to have an informed conversation. So, and this is one of the discussions that came up last night at PS Squared, that you know, if we can at least meet some of these disciplines halfway, then we can have some agency in shaping the direction that a project might have, or using these as a way to inform or gain some power in the conversation. So first up, Indy Yoha, London-based practice called 00. I'm calling the civic entrepreneur. His terrific book, Compendium for the Civic Economy, does a similar thing to this in that it pulls together a whole series of case studies around what he describes as the civic economy, which is a sort of local-based institutions directed to a civic purpose. This is a project they're working on at the moment, which I think is fantastic. It's called the Scale-Free School, and it tries to assemble all the elements required of a school, so a primary school, from buildings and facilities which exist currently within a neighbourhood. So the public library becomes the school library, a local cafe, they get vouchers to get their lunches there, cinemas become lecture halls, the park becomes their sports grounds, etc. And all that is integrated with mobiles, so the format can become flexible. If a room changes, if they get an alert, they get an update. Student cards, uniforms which create the identity, buses, minibuses, bikes, etc. So it's this idea that you can, with very little capital outlay, you can create a school just with the pieces that you have lying around. And I think that's, on the one hand, enabled by new technologies such as the Wi-Fi or the mobiles which integrate the whole thing. And it's a sort of, clever and generous way to think about how architecture can be embedded within a context. So perhaps this scenario is your approach to do a new school, and instead of beginning by drawing a plan, you research what else is out there and see how that money could be spent in a more intelligent way, and to make use of the things that are out there already. The other project which I find a really inspiring precedent is called the Fintry Development Trust, which 00 consulted on. And the story, as Indy tells it, is this local, or this community in the south of Scotland were approached by an energy company who wanted to build an array of wind turbines on their hill adjacent to their town. And the normal response, in my experience, is to sharpen the pitchforks and fight these evil capitalists from destroying our hill. But instead, these enlightened townsfolk saw it as an opportunity. They're also interested in sustainability. They're interested in clean energy. They thought that the windmills were not such an ugly thing after all, and formed an energy cooperative, and have purchased an extra wind turbine, which is then managed by the company. So it's their turbine. The money that is generated from it, or the energy that's generated from it, is returned to the town. They've used the revenue to increase the sustainable envelopes of their houses, and also to build some new facilities such as a town hall and improve the sports hall. And of 900 people in the town, I think 600 people are active and paid up members of this cooperative. And which is also the reason why they now need a town hall. I think this process of coming together and meeting has also reinforced the community spirit. So, and this is them signing their names on their own turbine, which I think is quite cool. And it's a great example of how, to come back to this. I'm not going to keep shouting about how pointless community gardens are. There is a point to them. But this is, I think, a great counterexample to show where that community scale approach can be applied to the real scale of economy and energy. Now, Jeannie Gang of the Chicago-based practice studio Gang, I would describe as a professional generalist, particularly with this one project to do with the canals and the issue of species evasion around Chicago. So this is a photo from 1914, cutting a new canal called the Calumet feeder from Chicago into the Mississippi. So Chicago had this problem with its sewerage, which wasn't being drained elsewhere. It was just sitting around in the Great Lakes, and at points it would catch on fire. It was this kind of burning turd pile. It was very poor for morale. So they had the great concept of dumping it all into the Mississippi, which must have seemed like a terrific idea at the time. Someone else's problem, it all goes downstream. In the spirit of Burnham, make no little plans. Let's really deal with this sewerage. So this is the before picture. This is the watershed that separates the Great Lakes from the Mississippi. These are these new canals which they forged in across the watershed, thereby uniting the two. And this is the contemporary dilemma. Asian carp, which are invasive species, have moved their whole way up to Chicago. They've been deterred by electric underwater fences and charging of the water and various other attempts to stop their encroaching on the Great Lakes. Some people say they're already there. Fishermen have caught a few. They're incredibly destructive on ecosystems, and if they get into the Great Lakes, it's a $1 billion problem for the industries. And, so there's a lot of effort being made to stop that. And Jeannie Gang, as an architect, has come into this very conflicted, very layered, very complex issue involving, all sorts of layers and a national scale of ecology, and just describes herself as a translator or an integrator. So she's selected different people to get around the table, ranging from somebody from the military who have security jurisdiction over the waterways, ecologists, landscape urbanists, developers who are thinking about new neighbourhoods to try and fund some sort of project. And this is what they've come up with. So by taking these diverse inputs, filtering them through the ability of an architect to synthesize and make decisions and return with a proposal, she's proposed a new neighbourhood of Chicago, which is a wetland which will encourage particular species which can then deter the onslaught of the Asian carp, while also providing new opportunities for living. So in contrast to this Burnham, I would say this is also not making little plans, but it's making informed plans. So instead of this singular industrial vision of one problem, sewerage, one answer, canal, this is a still large scale, still visionary, but it's informed by so many different voices that it's ecological in that sense, and hopefully more successful. And unlike the modernist failures we've seen earlier. Next up, I'm just going to take a quick slide. Marcus Westbury, as I mentioned, has a background in hosting arts festivals, so youth arts festivals. He's a native of Newcastle, which is in Australia, not the one in UK, but I've been told has a similar predicament. It's been hollowed out by a declining industry. Its retail has been hollowed out by big box stores on the periphery. And this street, which is Hunter Street Mall, this sort of heart of the city, now looks more like this. And apparently that's lunchtime bustle. Most of the buildings are either boarded up or and have since been torched. There's nothing. There's no people. There's no business. There's no, and it's a sort of dangerous place to go. Marcus, who cares about the city and has experience in negotiating different ideas, but is also good at doing things on a shoelace. He went in there and talked to the building owners. You know, why don't you have any tenants? What's the issue? Why is this street so impoverished? And they're on the one hand holding out for a big paying tenant, and so they won't let it to anybody for cheap. But nobody's willing to pay that because it's such a terrible thing. So you're stuck in this cycle. He saw an opportunity he saw on the one hand all these empty spaces in the centre of town, on the other hand all these creative people making brilliant work in their own living rooms, and thought, well, if we can bring these two ideas together somehow, what would be the kind of, last night we were talking about a ninja move, like a 1-inch punch which can unravel the whole complexity. He went in and designed a new tenancy agreement, which was based on a short-term rolling lease. So if somebody came along and wanted to lease it out as a real shop, then they could take it. But effectively allowed these creatives to occupy these spaces, fix them up. So this is a before and after. This is this smashed-in shopfront. These are the owners. And now it's a record store. So they didn't have to do much, but they're there, and they've done dozens, I think 40 or 50 of these projects. The other thing that Marcus did was set up a not-for-profit which acts as an intermediary. So they take on a lot of the burden of insurance and deposit. The creatives pay a nominal, very low amount of rent, just as a kind of show of faith, and it makes it more real. And so I think half of them have been able to transition into fully operated, functioning businesses, and the other half, and anyway, this is a kind of general map, and this is what it looks like now on a Saturday. I've been told Marcus has shown this picture to Newcastle locals, and they say, they either say that's not Hunter Street, or they say that's Photoshop. That you've just stripped those people in, and it's impossible. The other side of the story, which I really like, is that throughout all of this, Marcus was never contacted by the local council or the planning agency. They'd recently spent $10 million renovating the plaza. So that they'd employed architects to say, how would you fix this place? And they'd said, well, we need new paving, we need new seats, we need new street trees, we need, we need to make it nice on a physical, visual level, which of course did absolutely nothing and just cost millions of dollars. So this one strategic move, which cost nothing, he funded it his time on his credit card and borrowed some legal advice from a friend, has turned the whole thing around. And now, of course, he's consulting all over Australia. There's, I think, 5 or 6 of these same ideas going in different cities, and also consulting overseas just with this simple strategic move. And I think it's a great example of a non-architectural strategy that results in architecture, a successful urban space, which of course is the Cedric Price maneuver. We all know that story. I love it. I love it because it makes it shows the sort of stupidity of architects. This is another Australian example, apologies. Is my hero, this guy, Robin Boyd. This is him here. He died in 1971. He was our kind of modernist hero from the 50s and 60s. Died too young, never really developed built anything of substance, but left an incredible mark as a cultural critic and as somebody who had a vision for where Australia could be and who cared about it in a similar way to Marcus. He was, on the one hand, a really great architect. This is his house for the furniture designer Featherston, which they said we want to live in a garden, so that each of the rooms are just a different platform within a big greenhouse. And this is in '59, really radical, amazing stuff. He managed to cultivate an international network at a time when it took 5 hops to go from Australia to Europe. This is him giving a tour of Gropius around Melbourne, and was a fearless cultural critic. So this is his bestseller in Australia. It sold 200,000 copies. It transcended architecture. It was a public hit, and it was basically talking about how ugly the Australian suburbs were, which is a surprising thing to be popular. Chopping off the trees, power lines everywhere, attaching unrelated ornament onto the front of houses. I mean, it's the same story all over the world. He thought it was particularly bad in Australia, and instead of just complaining, he went on and did something about it. So this was he set up this what was called the Small Homes Service, where he was sponsored by the local newspaper, The Age. He had a weekly column and a small office of draftspeople. So he would sketch out a house, and each week they would design a new house and document it very simply. So this was the 60s, so you could really document a whole house on 2 A1 sheets, not like today. Each week then he would write about it, describe the house in the newspaper, and then people could come to the Small Homes office and buy that set of plans which they could give directly to a builder. It had a huge impact. 50,000 homes were built directly from these plans, and then it's estimated another 150,000 were directly influenced by it. So that's when somebody says, can you do this but add another room, or a builder just does a multiple. 40% of new homes at the time in Victoria were built using this system. So so from the cultural critique to actually being instrumental in turning it around, and now Melbourne has this incredible, again, a generous inheritance of terrific modernist buildings, and this kick-started the careers of some of the other really great young architects as well, and continued for a number of decades. Large scale. Urban activist Camilla Bustamante, who I came across, she was studying her master's in Amsterdam. She studied graphic design there, and she comes from Peru, from Lima, where there is in the 80s it was proposed a new metro network across the whole city. And the whole process got clogged in corruption, and the money went missing, and the government changed, and they only built 5 kilometres of track and 2 stops. And the train just goes back and forth once a week for maintenance reasons, and it's a kind of cruel reminder of what was promised. Her response to this was she was first of all surprised to discover the entire plan. She'd never heard of it. She never knew that there was a big plan for Lima's Metro. And then went and discovered that there was all these stations planned. They all had names, and then worked out how long it would take them to finish this based on the current rate of construction, which has been on and off for a number of decades. So I think. Oops. Yeah, the project is called Lima Metro 2,400. The metro is coming, so at the current rate, by the time they get to the airport will be in 400 years. And each station then is given a number, the year of completion. And she went around the city putting up fake signs and talking to people and distributing metro maps and telling people, yeah, this will be in your neighbourhood in 200 years. So, you know, aren't you lucky? Yeah. And she's very sort of bashful about it. The interesting other layers which I discovered later is that the Prime Minister who proposed this in the 80s is now back in power, and so it's been a way of making him accountable for his announcements in the past, and it caused a huge. It was sort of front page news. These maps and her stickers. She fled the country. She said she got a lot of people when she was putting up the stickers saying, "You really better be careful. You know, you don't want to annoy this guy." So she went back to Amsterdam to kind of, for her own sake. Since then, she's been back and kind of welcomed, and she's been on all these talk shows, and it became a real thing. And you know, lots of other independent campaigns to build the metro. The other thing I should say is that in Lima, it's a social justice issue. So the city is very segregated in terms of wealth and class, and people can spend up to 40% of their income just on commuting to do the low-paid jobs in the centre. So you know, it's more than just a convenience issue. It's really a social justice issue, as she describes it. Anyway, 6 months later, construction on the metro resumes, and she's kind of not willing to take credit, but the timeline suggests that it just needed this push. And so with the smallest intervention, one afternoon of putting up stickers, the actual thing, they've committed to building the first 2 lines. I mean, dozens of kilometres of track and multiple stations. So I'm using this as the example of large scale, partly because it's the most small scale on the one hand, but it also has the biggest effect. So it's again another strategy which has incredible heavy infrastructural implications, but is achieved in such a strategic way. This is my final example, and it's a new one I've added to the deck, which I was introduced to yesterday. I'm calling it long term, even though it's more like medium term. I don't have a grand plan or a grand lecture on this one. I don't even know this guy's name. He showed us this picture. This is the day he acquired this site. It's on what Paul described as a kind of 2 out of 10 level, conflict level interface. I don't even know what part of the city it's in. I was just really impressed with his resolve and commitment to an idea. This is his cafe, which he's built out of shipping containers. He designed it himself. It's got one glass wall with a door at one end, shutters which can be folded over to defend it at night. He describes his sort of occupation as arriving every morning at 7 a.m, leaving at 7 p.m, erasing the graffiti that gets put on the thing, picking up the rubbish and just being there, just being in this very provocative centre of conflict, and just kind of, he's sort of, here he is, just kind of wonderfully diffuses this corner which it still sort of rattles with tension. My point is, and the reason he's long term, is that this is familiar to architects. This looks like a pop-up. This looks like a groovy shoe store that we put down in the docks for the weekend, or a summer market or something fun. He's been there for 3 years, every day, just doing it. He's not looking for any pat on the shoulder. And I think just by being there, it's somehow important and architectural, and I was really inspired by his kind of attitude. So, in conclusion, make no little plans. We've gone full circle with Burnham. ambition, but informed by different attitudes, different people, different contexts. And I've got 2 quotes to really finish with. This is Bruce Mao from the interview I did with him. Again, a sort of outsider looking in. If you think about architecture as a methodology, independent of the outcome, as agnostic from its product, you would see that architecture has deep culture of synthesis informed by civic values. If you have that capacity, that's the most valuable capacity of this time of history. And finally, Wouter van Stiphout again, if an architect is humble, then what good are they? Thank you.
Sure, there will be many questions, so is there any questions?
We also have books for sale. Yes.
It's the one thing I think that's missing off your list, Rory, is the architect as pedagogue. Because I think that in the main, that's where they're most effective.
It's in the book.
Is it? Right. Oh,
there's a couple of examples, but
yeah,
it's and
I don't mean teaching students of architecture, by the way. I mean like in a societal pedagogical role.
No, well that's true.
Okay, well then tell us some examples of those people.
Well, the example I have is Mel Dodd, who was a part of MUF and has since moved to Australia. And I mean, you would probably know more about her work than I do, but it seems to me is a really great example of somebody from within an institution who's looking outward and involving students in live projects in difficult scenarios and getting out of this bubble of renderings and generative forms, you know. So some of her interventions are very small. She did a project called the name of the city, and it was just a bench, and it was a kind of terrain map of their territory. And then they just hung out there for a while and used it as a way to engage people in a difficult part of town. It sounds kind of, you know, low scale, and I'm telling the story terribly. But there's some interesting. I think it's an interesting precedent for an educator to be taking students out of their comfort zones. You know, in my experience, architects are most comfortable when they've been told what to do, they've been given the job, and they get to click away on AutoCAD and that incredible, exhilarating sense of power you have over this black background and white lines. You know, there's nothing. That's the kind of ultimate space of thinking. And I think she rejects that, not in the sense that you need to hand draw, but in the sense that you actually need to go and stomp around and talk to people. Which shouldn't be radical, but it somehow is.
Sorry, how do you think this manifests in School of Architecture in general? Because, I don't know, for me, having been in different schools, I've very rarely seen any of these, the list that you have, actually have an impact on how, especially in higher levels, I guess, where there's a lot of emphasis on design as something to make things and not just design as related to other disciplines and the world, the real world.
Yeah. Again, I wouldn't set them up as a choice, as we need to leave design behind, or this very crafted thing. I would hope that that's, I mean, the power of that stuff is that it's so permanent, and if it's embodied with this kind of deeper knowledge, then it can make such a permanent impact. So I think it's, you know, the examples I showed today are not sort of capital A architectural real buildings in that sense, but hopefully they sort of spark off ideas that can be channeled into this kind of thinking. And I think, you know, students they want to do that. I mean, the strange contradiction or irony of architectural education is that we're filled with this you know, social ambition, or that, you know, it's a real that we're kind of public servants in the broadest, most generous sense. But the reality of practice is so different. The reality of practice is your first job out of school is documenting the toilet block. Yeah. Or office suspended ceiling. I mean, that's the kind of bread and butter of the reality. And I think that, again, it doesn't need to be this binary, that the one thing can be informed by the other. Yeah. But we need to remain naive and, visionary.
What would you say, what's your comment on, because some architects' ideas of the future is, if you like, just to pedal faster and to do what we do as architects traditionally, just do it even better, and that will solve and do it cheaper. Yeah, is that the answer, or one of the answers? Do you think?
Definitely not. I know. I feel like that we hit a strange fork in the road, and I'm not sure when it happened. It was probably hundreds of years ago, when we decided that the architect wasn't a kind of social strategist, but they were somebody really good at building, or really good at managing the process of the quality of light, or the quality of materials, or the stuff of architecture. And I think, like I said, that needs to be part of it. And perhaps this pedaling faster, what you're talking about, is to get better at that. Better at light, better at materials, better at making things cheaper. And I think our obsession with prefabrication, or with parametrics, or with sustainable evaluation is all part of that better, which